Good morning. It is a joy to see everyone out this morning, a joy to be able to come together to worship our God, to listen to His voice within the Scriptures. I invite you to open your Bibles to Matthew 24. Matthew 24, we are going to be spending quite a bit of time in this chapter this morning. Many in the religious world today have a deep fascination in end times prophecies. And there are many different ideas about the end of the world. There's premillennialism, postmillennialism, amillennialism, full preterism, or the AD 70 doctrine, partial preterism, pre-tribulation rapture, mid-tribulation rapture, or post-tribulation rapture. You don't need to know any of that. What we do need to know is the Scriptures. And so many times we get all these different ideas in the religious world about what's going to happen in the end times, but what we need to know more than anything is simply, what do the Scriptures say? And a lot of those different ideas about the end times, they come from two primary places, from misunderstanding many times, two primary sections of Scripture, one being the book of Revelation. And while we may do a study in Revelation at some point, we're not going to spend try to cover the entire book of Revelation today. But the other place that it often comes from is Matthew chapter 24. And so I do want us to spend today looking through Matthew 24, and I encourage you to open your Bibles, because by the end of this study, we're going to have read every verse in this chapter. We're just going to kind of work our way through it and see what Matthew 24 does say and what it doesn't say about the second coming of Jesus and the end of the world. Matthew 24 begins with a question. Really, it begins with three questions that the disciples ask. If you look in verse 3 of Matthew 24, it says, "As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?'" Now, I think in their minds, those questions might have been a little bit more closely related than they really were. But they ask essentially three questions. First of all, when will these things be? What is that referring to? We'll look back in verse 1 and 2. It says, "Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, 'You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down.'" So when they ask, when will these things be, they're asking about what Jesus had just said, that the stones, every stone of the temple is going to be thrown down, not one is going to be left on another. He had just at the end of chapter 23 said, "Behold, your house is left to you desolate or uninhabited," that God was going to leave his temple because of the unfaithfulness of the Jewish people. And so, before we start jumping forward thousands of years into the future to talk about the end of the world, we first need to understand that the initial question they ask is specifically about the destruction of that temple, right? Which we see happening 40 years later in AD 70. So before we can understand Matthew 24, we need to at least begin there. But they do ask two other questions. What will be the sign of your coming? Now, what do they mean by that? I'm not sure if they fully understand what the idea of Jesus' coming involves. And throughout the Scripture, Jesus' coming is pictured in a few different ways. It's not always talking about the same thing. But you can understand why they might have associated the destruction of the temple with Jesus' coming, because read the very end of chapter 23. Chapter 23, verse 37 through 39. Jesus says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you are not willing? See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Do you see how the idea of the house being left to them desolate or uninhabited and the coming of Jesus might be associated together in their mind here? Essentially, the idea is that God is going to leave the temple. He's going to leave it uninhabited, and they will not have God with them again. They will not have God's presence, not be in fellowship with him again, until they welcome Jesus as the Messiah, quoting from the language of Psalm 118. But what coming is Jesus speaking of here? Is it him coming in ultimate judgment at the end of the world? Well, it seems it more readily applies to Jesus coming in his kingdom, or taking his heavenly throne as king, or maybe even personally coming into fellowship with believers who are turning to him and welcoming him as king in their lives. In Matthew chapter 16, he had said this about his coming. Matthew 16 and verse 28, "Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Now, are we talking about the end of the world there? Well, no, he says there's some of you, some of these apostles, who are going to still be living when you see me coming in my kingdom. So we're not talking about the end of time, unless you think that there are some of those apostles still walking the earth today. No, he says that was going to happen in that generation. And so we see the idea of Jesus coming in his kingship being fulfilled as he establishes the new covenant, takes his heavenly throne to rule over his redeemed people within the church today. So while the apostles may not have had a clear picture of what they were asking, Jesus' coming is used to describe a few different things in Scripture. His coming in kingship, his coming in judgment, sometimes in a limited sense against a specific people or nation, and his ultimate coming, what we often call the second coming. And so as we read through Matthew 24, we need to keep our eyes open, because there's going to be multiple applications of this idea of Jesus' coming, and we need to be discerning about what coming we're talking about. But the last question they ask, and what is the sign of the end of the age? Once again, it seems the apostles are tying together all three of these questions in their minds. The idea of the temple being destroyed, that seems to be the end of the age, maybe the end of the world. But the question is, are we talking about the end of the current age, the end of Israel as God's covenant people? Or are we talking about the end of the coming age, the end of God's new covenant people here on earth in ultimate judgment? Well, Matthew 13, Jesus had used this phrase. Matthew 13 might have been a place that they had heard Jesus talk about the end of the age when he tells the parable of the wheat and the tares. He says in Matthew 13, starting in verse 39, "And the enemy who sowed these tares is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous shall shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Here, when Jesus says the end of the age, it seems pretty clear in this context that we are talking about ultimate judgment, right? When there will be those who are sent off into the fires of hell, and those who are gathered into the barn, gathered into the eternal kingdom. And so while the apostles kind of ask all three of these questions together, when will these things be, the destruction of the temple? When will your coming be, and when will be the sign of the end of the age? Jesus, in his response, isn't going to be able to give just kind of one simple answer, right? Because there are many different things that are kind of tangled together in the disciples' understanding of their own questions. And so how is Jesus going to untangle that? How is he going to answer their questions, even though their questions are not really all relating to the exact same thing? Well, as we read through Matthew 24, we want to keep our eyes open for Jesus answering in some way or another all of these questions, and maybe answering some of these questions in different ways, different aspects of his coming at different times. The first thing that we see Jesus saying in verse 4 through 24, if you want to read with me starting in verse 4, it says, "And Jesus answered them, 'See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Do you notice the first thing Jesus says in response to their question? See that no one leads you astray. Right? The way Jesus begins his answer should be a big warning sign that there are going to be a lot of false ideas about Jesus' coming and the end of the world. There are going to be false messiahs. There are going to be wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines and earthquakes. And what does Jesus say about that? He says, see that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. He calls these the beginning of birth pains. There are going to be many false alarms leading up to his coming judgment. We'll talk about what he's talking about when he says the end here. If it's the end of God's covenant people, Israel, or if it's the end of the world. But essentially what Jesus says is there are going to be many different things happening that are going to cause people in the world to say, hey, this is it. This is the end of time. When you hear people predicting the end of the world, what evidence do they often reference? Well, there's wars and rumors of wars, and there's famines, and there's earthquakes, and there's all these cataclysmic things happening. This is coming up to the end of the world. What does Jesus say about that? Don't be alarmed. That's going to happen. That's the beginning of birth pains. The end is not yet. The very thing that our world often points to say, oh, the end of the world is coming. Jesus says, no. No, a lot of that is going to happen between now and the end of the world. Don't be deceived. Don't be alarmed. Trust in me. And Jesus goes on to warn them that there will be many hardships for his followers. There will be many who will fall away, but those who endure to the end will be saved. They will be hated by all nations, and yet the gospel will go out to all nations. And so, yes, there's going to be great suffering, and yet there is hope that if they endure, if they continue, that God's work will be accomplished in his world. Now, based on what Jesus is going to go on to say, when he says, then the end will come, maybe he's fast forwarding all the way into the future and talking about the end of the world. But what he's about to say is going to apply a little bit more readily to their first question. When are these things going to take place? When is the temple going to be destroyed? When is going to be the end of Israel as God's covenant people, the end of that age? And so as we go into the next section, he gives them a sign to look for. Matthew 24, starting in verse 15, says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Okay, so Jesus gives them a sign to look for. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. Now this is found in Daniel 11 and verse 31, and we're not going to have the time today to go back and study Daniel 11 in depth, but in Daniel 11, it talks about the king of Persia, the king of Greece. It talks about Egypt there. And it says in Daniel 11, verse 31, forces from him, talking about the king of the north, shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. The abomination of desolation. Now remember, just a moment ago, at the end of chapter 23, it says, behold, your house is left to you desolate, right? God is going to abandon the temple. He's going to leave it uninhabited. And what is going to cause that? Well, Daniel talked about this happening, that they would get rid of the worship to God and replace it with an abomination, causing God to forsake his temple, for God to leave. Ezekiel pictures God leaving the temple in his prophecies. And so the abomination that makes desolate is a reference, it seems, to idolatrous images being brought into the temple and causing God to vacate the premises because it's been profaned. And in the context of Daniel, as he talks about the king of Persia and the king of Greece and Egypt involved there, if we were to go back and dig into that passage a little bit more deeply, we see that that is fulfilled during the intertestamental period between the end of Malachi and the beginning of Matthew. After Alexander the Great, his kingdom after his death is split into four pieces, and the Seleucid kingdom, there's a king named Antiochus Epiphanes who comes and he wants to fight against Egypt, but he is kept from doing that, and so instead he turns against Jerusalem. And he comes in and he takes over the temple complex, and he sets up a pagan shrine, idolatrous shrine, and the place of God's altar. And he begins offering swine where God's altar had been. He profanes the temple. He, in fact, does a great deal more to keep the Jewish people from following God's law and replaces the worship of Yahweh there with idols. And so you see the fulfillment of Daniel 11 really already happening in between the two testaments. The abomination that makes desolation is fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes, which then leads to, some of you might have heard of the Maccabean revolt, is really a response to what Antiochus Epiphanes did. But here Jesus in Matthew 24 says, look for the abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke of. Now wait a second, if Daniel's prophecy was already fulfilled in between the two testaments, then what is Jesus talking about? It seems what he's saying is what happened back then, it's going to happen again. Look for the same things that happened in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, the same things that Daniel prophesied, that they're going to happen again. He says, let the reader understand. And what we see in AD 70, 40 years after Jesus spoke this, is that because of the uprising of various factions of zealots in Jerusalem, the Romans send General Titus to set siege to the city of Jerusalem in AD 70. And after about a 5-month siege, they burn the temple to the ground. And by the way, because of the fire, the gold melts down into the stones. And the reason not one stone is left on another is because they're digging in there to get the gold out, right? So not one stone is left on another. Jesus says, just like it happened back in the days that Daniel prophesied of, it's going to happen again. And when you see the idolatrous image of the Roman standard entering into the holy city, God's people are instructed to flee to the mountains. By the way, the parallel passage in Luke 21 has Jesus making a similar statement. He says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart. Are we talking about the second coming here? Are we talking about final judgment? Well, if so, what good would fleeing to the mountains do, right? Why are those in Judea told to flee to the mountains? Well, it makes a whole lot of sense in the context of the destruction of Jerusalem, the initial question that the disciples ask, right? That just like it happened back in the days that Daniel prophesied is going to happen again. And when you see it happening, when you see the Romans coming into Jerusalem, then you flee to the mountains. Because there's going to be a Roman persecution that's going to ramp up after AD 70, and the days following that, even to the point that Christianity is outlawed, that disciples are being impaled and burned and thrown to the lions for public amusement. And that's a lot of what the book of Revelation is going to refer to. And so you see the phrase in here, verse 21, for then there will be great tribulation. Now, in many of these end-time theories, the phrase great tribulation describes a time of great suffering at the end of the world, either after the rapture or before the rapture, and immediately preceding the 1,000-year reign of Christ here on earth, right? But here in Matthew 24, when the phrase great tribulation is used, it pretty clearly is referring to what's going to happen in the destruction of the temple, right? We're not fast-forwarding thousands of years into the future. We're talking about what was going to happen to the people at that time when those in Judea are told to flee to the mountains, when the temple is destroyed in AD 70, and yes, not one stone is left on another. And Jesus goes on to say that this is not when he is coming. Look at Matthew 24, verse 23 through 28. It says, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. He says, at this time, many are going to claim that the Christ is here, right? The Messiah has come. And you can see why that message would have been so attractive, right? They're in the midst of this oppression by the Roman power. They're experiencing great suffering. And when somebody gives them the light of hope that, hey, the Messiah is showing up, and he's going to lead us against Rome, and he's going to bring us victory and bring us back to the glory days of David, that people would be tempted to believe that. But Jesus says, don't believe it. No, that's not how I'm going to come or when I'm going to come. And when he goes on to talk about his coming, he says it's going to be unmistakable, right? It will be like the lightning that lights up the sky from one end of heaven to another. It's not going to be, oh, there's somebody out here in the wilderness or there's somebody here in the inner room. When Jesus comes, you're going to know it, right? And he uses another illustration. He says, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. It seems the picture here might be, if you go out here and you see a bunch of vultures or birds of prey circling, what do you know? There's a corpse somewhere, right? You didn't have to see it, you didn't have to smell it, but you can see it. It's obvious. And I think that's the same picture as the lightning from one end of heaven to the other. Are like the birds gathering over a corpse. But that doesn't sound like a message of hope, does it? No, that sounds like a message of judgment. That Jesus, when he comes, is going to bring judgment to the Jewish people, to the nation of Israel, not salvation to the physical kingdom of Israel. And so as he goes on to talk about his coming here, we need to ask, what coming are we talking about? It seems a coming in judgment is what is getting ready to be discussed. Read with me in verse 29 through 35. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in the heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from the end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branches becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Okay, surely we're talking about the second coming here, right? We're talking about final judgment. It sounds like that. But did you notice a couple things about this passage? Number one, it says immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now, if we followed the entire chapter and we've seen the context, we're talking about the tribulation that's occurring in Judea and among those who are there upon the destruction of the temple. And he goes on to say in verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So while the language sounds like ultimate judgment day, we should at least have some pause here, because it seems like contextually he's saying it's immediately going to happen. It's going to happen in that generation. So what are we talking about then? Well, if we're familiar with the Old Testament prophets, this kind of language should not be new to us. Right? This is prophetic language of God's judgment, often against a nation or a people. And while it certainly foreshadows the events of final judgment and is used in language that strongly connects with final judgment, it's not always used in that way. Let's look at a few Old Testament examples. Turn your Bibles to Isaiah 13. Isaiah 13, this is in the section of Isaiah that is written to the nations. Chapter 13 through 23, he'll have an oracle against Babylon, an oracle against Philistia, an oracle against Moab, and so on and so forth. Well, he starts that off with Babylon in verse 1, the oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. Now look down in verse 9 and 10. It says, behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation, and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. That sounds kind of like the language of Matthew 24, right? The light in heavens are going to be darkened or turned to blood or going to fall from the sky. Well, here it uses similar language to that. It sounds like a cataclysmic event here, but what is it talking about? Well, in chapter 13, verse 1, we know who we're talking about. We're talking about the kingdom of Babylon. Even though it is final judgment language, it's not final judgment for the world. It's final judgment for the kingdom of Babylon, right? It's not the end of the world, it's the end of their kingdom. And so it's lights out for them, is kind of the picture, right? Look at Ezekiel 32. Ezekiel 32. If you look in verse 1, or maybe verse 2, we can see this more clearly. It says, Son of man, raise a lamentation over Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say to him. So who's Ezekiel prophesying to? He's prophesying to the ruler of Egypt, to Pharaoh. Now look down in verse 7 and 8. When I blot you out, I will cover the heavens and make their stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. All the bright lights of heaven will I make dark over you and put darkness on your land, declares the Lord God. Lights out for you, Pharaoh, right? And so while it's language that is very poetic in nature, it's prophetic language describing God's final judgment for a specific ruler, for a specific people, right? And so it uses final judgment language because it's the end of their world, right? It's the end of their kingdom. Look at Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost. Do you remember what Peter quotes from here? Some of the people claim that those who are speaking in tongues are just filled with new wine. They're just drunk. But Peter says in verse 15, for these people are not drunk as you suppose, since it is only the third hour of the day. But this is what was uttered through the prophet Joel. And in the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams, even on my male servants and female servants. In those days I will pour out my spirit, and they shall prophesy. Notice verse 19. And I will show wonders in the heavens above, and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness, and the moon to blood, before the day of the Lord comes, the great and magnificent day. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. So he's quoting from the prophet Joel, and it sounds like end of the world language, right? Cataclysmic events, the moon being turned into blood. But what does Peter say about this prophecy? He says, this is what was uttered by the prophet Joel. Right? What you're seeing right now, what you're experiencing right now, is what Joel was talking about. And Joel talked about the pouring out of God's Spirit. When is that happening? Well, it's happening right now. He says, and anyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. When is that being made available? It's being made available right now, right? And so when Joel talks about the moon being turned to blood, the day of the Lord coming, he is using judgment language that foreshadows the end of the world, yes. But is he talking about the end of the world? No, he's talking about how God is going to bring judgment against his people, against those who have rejected the Messiah. And yet, those who turn to the Messiah will have an opportunity to be saved. So this language is judgment language. Judgment of God over nations. And yes, it sounds like the end of the world. It's the end of their world. It's the final judgment for them. And yes, foreshadows ultimate judgment. So when we come back to Matthew 24, and we read that these things are going to happen immediately after the tribulation of those days, and that it's going to happen in that generation, and then we read language that sounds like the end of the world, I think what we're reading is God is bringing final judgment against his people. They are no longer going to be his covenant people. You know, how many times did God bring judgment against Israel? Again and again and again and again. But there was going to come a time where it would be his final judgment against his people. They would no longer be his covenant people, and he would form a new covenant people. And so when it talks about Jesus coming, taking his rule, coming in his power and glory, and gathering his people from the four winds of the earth, it's not just gathering them to take them to heaven, it's gathering them to be part of his kingdom. He's establishing a new kingdom. In fact, the language of the one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven comes from Daniel chapter 7, that describes him receiving a kingdom, receiving dominion. And so the coming of Jesus that we're talking about seems to be the same coming that Matthew chapter 16 verse 28 was talking about, that will happen in this generation when he comes to take his throne over his kingdom. And he comes to gather his people together, his new covenant people, in his kingdom. And yes, it foreshadows final judgment. It uses language that sounds like final judgment. But Jesus says it's going to happen in this generation. I want you to notice two things about the section that we just read here in Matthew 24. One, verse 32 and 33, let's read that again. Matthew 24, 32 and 33. It says, "From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates." It says, there are going to be signs. You're going to see them, and you're going to know that Jesus is coming, right? Remember that. Number two, he says, all these things are going to take place in this generation. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Now go to the next section with me. And I want you to see a contrast in what he then says, starting in verse 36. So let's read verse 35. It says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But concerning that day and hour. The Greek phrase, but concerning blank, is often used in the scripture to mark a transition in thought. In fact, it's used multiple times in the book of 1 Corinthians as Paul moves from one topic to another. I think 6 different times. He says, but concerning meat sacrifice to idols, but concerning spiritual gifts, but concerning the collection for the saints, right? So he transitions to some new topic. Well, that's what we see here in verse 36, but concerning that day and hour. And what does Jesus say about that day and hour? He says nobody knows. Right? He just finished saying, when you see these signs, you will know that it's coming. And now he says, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows. Are we talking about the same thing? By the time you get to chapter 25, and you see the parable of the 10 virgins, by the way, he's going to say the same thing about that in verse 13 of 25. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor hour. When you get to the parable of the 10 virgins and the parable of the talents and the judgment scene at the end of chapter 25, we're obviously talking about final judgment, right? When he's going to take the sheep and the goats and part them from right to left. We started chapter 24 talking about the destruction of the temple, but by the time we get into chapter 25, we're obviously talking about final judgment. Where does that transition take place? I think the most logical conclusion is that he makes that transition in verse 36. But concerning that day and hour, what day and hour? Well, he just said, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour, not when Jerusalem is going to pass away, not when Israel is going to pass away, when heaven and earth pass away, that day and hour, no one knows. There's not going to be a sign. In fact, he uses the example of the people in the days of Noah. And there wasn't, some type of ramping up of birth pains that led towards the flood. There wasn't some signs that the people saw other than the preaching of Noah that a flood was coming, right? In fact, people were living just like they always have. They were marrying and giving in marriage. They were, eating and drinking until the day that it took them unaware. He says that's the way that day and hour is going to be. The judgment that he talked about, the coming that he talked about in the previous section, he says you're going to see signs. It's like the fig tree. You're going to look at it, you're going to know that it's coming, so flee to the mountains. But that day and hour, they're not going to be signs. You're not going to have a 24-hour countdown. You're not going to have anything that's going to indicate that it's on its way. And then notice the way he describes this judgment. It says 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding in the mill, one taken and one left. This is not going to be the indiscriminate judgment of a conquering army who is coming in and just wiping out everything in their path. Right? This is the precise judgment of a just God who is judging each individual soul. That's the picture we have here. It's not the picture of General Titus coming to Jerusalem and wiping out everything, which is why Jesus has flee to the mountains. No, this is the picture that he's going to pick some and leave others to experience the eternal destruction. And yet there are those who are going to be gathered into his barn, so to speak. So look at the very last section of Matthew 24 with me. Verse 42 through 51. Verse 42 we already read. He said, therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eat and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Multiple times in that section, he says, you don't know the hour. You're not going to expect it. It's not going to come on a day that you're expecting it to. It's going to be just like the days of Noah. It's going to be just like any other day. Know this. If you knew it was coming, you'd be ready. And so you better be ready. You better live in a way that you are ready day by day. The important thing about final judgment is not that we know when it will happen, but that we know it will happen, and we are living in a way that we are ready for it to happen. Right? And so many people get so caught up in thinking, well, what are the signs that are going to precede final judgment? Well, he talks about signs that are going to precede his coming and judgment on Israel, on Jerusalem. But when he gets to that day and hour, he says there's not going to be any signs. It's going to be like a thief in the night. You're not going to expect it. It's going to be a day just like any other day, a day just like today. And so we simply need to know the kind of people Jesus wants us to be and live that way day by day. We don't need to know when Jesus is coming again. We need to know that we're in the right relationship with him every moment of every day. As brethren, let's make application to us as we close. When Jesus does come again in final judgment, there will be no warning signs. There's going to be no birth pains that are kind of ramping up and leading to the final judgment. There's not going to be a 24-hour countdown where a voice comes from heaven and says, okay, everybody, get your life in order because I'm getting ready to come. And he says it's going to come on a day that you don't expect. And people are going to be living the way that they always have. It's going to be a day like any other today. It's going to be a day like today. Essentially, every day that we live here on earth, we have a 50-50 chance that it's our last day. Because there isn't going to be some sign that it's on its way. It's going to be a day like any other day. And so the question for us is, are we ready for Jesus to come again? If it was later today, if it was tomorrow, would we be ready? Are we ready to stand before the Lord in judgment? Are you confident that if Jesus came tonight, if Jesus came right now, that you are abiding in his grace, that by the sacrifice of Jesus you would be able to stand boldly before the throne of God, knowing that you will be able to enter in and spend an eternity with your Lord? Or do you recognize that there are parts of your life that aren't what they should be? That Jesus might bring up some things that you wouldn't be so thrilled to hear? If that's the case, then let's make a change. Let's make a change right now. Because there is no reason that we can't leave these doors today knowing confidently that we are in a right relationship with the Lord. If we're willing to surrender our lives to Jesus, it's not about us reaching some level of spiritual maturity and proving ourselves to the Lord. It's about us genuinely surrendering to him and saying, okay, I know there's some things in my life that aren't what they need to be, but I'm going to surrender them to the Lord. And I'm day by day going to seek him and seek his strength and seek the support of my brethren to live the way that God desires me to. If that's my heart, if I have the heart of a repentant sinner today, there's more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 just persons. You can bring joy to the heart of God today. If you are convicted that there's some area of your life that needs to change, won't you lay that at the foot of the cross? If you've never committed your life to the Lord, you can surrender your life to him in baptism. You can bury your old life with Jesus, and by God's grace be raised to live a new life in him. And if you've made that commitment, but you know you're not living it, you know that the old man has kind of been dug back up, and he's doing pretty well, well, then will you allow Jesus to put him back to death today? Will you surrender that part of your life? Will you confess it before brethren? Ask for the prayers and the encouragement of these brethren. If it's of a public nature, we're going to invite you to do that now. If you need to come to the Lord in some way, we invite you to come forward to the front as we stand and sing at this time.